All right, since the smoke has cleared for the MacBook Neo, as I was going to bed a couple nights ago, it kind of dawned on me, what if Apple was trying to emit something with the announcement and the launch of the MacBook Neo? Otherwise, I do wonder if the iPad experience is not really panning out the way that Apple and Steve intended it to pan out when it relates to adoptability when users are replacing their laptops, because now we're back to the laptop. Now, hear me out on this thing. When you start comparing the MacBook Neo to something like an iPad, and it could be any iPad, and you add a magic keyboard and maybe a pencil, things they start to get interesting and awkward at the same time. Yet, before we move forward, make sure you hit that subscribe button. It really helps out the channel, and it also keeps me motivated to continue to make videos for you guys. So here's what I'm thinking. At this point, how many iPads do we have? We have the iPad Mini, we have the iPad Air, we have the iPad Pro. There might be another iPad in the mix somewhere, maybe just the iPad, but there is a lot of different iPads that we have. And, sometimes I do feel that Apple is just one step away from announcing another iPad. I don't know, the iPad Pro Max Ultra or something to that extent, but I feel like there might be another iPad in the works. And at some point, you really got to start asking yourself, do we really need that many iPads? And to be honest, I do have a iPad Pro. I have an M2 with an Apple Pencil, and it collects a lot of dust on my coffee table. To be quite honest with you, I tend to use my MacBook Pro and my iPhone, and the iPad just to some extent has fell by the wayside. I will say, to kind of give it some credit, I did use it a lot more when I was in college, but I still use my MacBook a lot more, I think, than my iPad, even when I was in college. Otherwise, here's where things get kind of interesting. The MacBook Neo, all it is an iPhone 16, if I'm not mistaken, inside of a MacBook body, which makes it really efficient, really cheap to produce for lighter workload. But here is the $1 million question. If Apple can make a cheap enough MacBook that runs fast enough for most people, it kind of makes you wonder, what is the role of the iPad? And, here's where the iPad gets itself in trouble. When you add a Magic Keyboard, you add a Apple Pencil, maybe a screen protector, maybe even a case for your iPad, you're starting to get into MacBook Air territory, particularly if you go refurbish on like something like Amazon. Yeah, meanwhile, the MacBook Neo gives you a real keyboard. It gives you a laptop, a real laptop experience. It gives you Mac OS, not iPad OS, at a cheaper price. And at this point, you kind of start to ask yourself, what is the iPad again? And you know what? This is where I think the strategy becomes really clear. I think the MacBook Neo was built for schools, colleges, libraries, computer labs, as opposed to you give a child or a student a iPad and you have a keyboard and accessories, and things can get really messy. With the MacBook Neo, you make sure it's charged, they open it up, and then they can just start working. And you know what? Like I mentioned before, inside of the MacBook Neo is the brains of an iPhone, which made me think it would be kind of cool if at some point we get a MacBook Neo with 5G. I think that would be kind of cool. You don't have to worry about hotspots or finding some shady Wi-Fi. You just, open up your laptop and you are connected. So here's a question I want to throw to you guys. Is the MacBook Neo quietly replacing the iPad in terms of what it was supposed to be? Or is Apple just admitting that the iPad is great for some people, but not for everyone? Otherwise, one last question for you guys. Would you prefer an iPad with tons of accessories, or would you prefer a MacBook Neo? Let me know in the comment section below. I appreciate you guys watching to the end, and I will talk to you guys in the next one. Later.